So thank you, everybody. I recognize some of the names on here. You know that I'm with Manatee County Audubon Society. I also am working with a partner biologist friend, and the two of us are creating a Florida Scrub Jay Conservation Society because we love the scrub jay and we want to see this bird survive. And I suspect that at least half of you know the struggles and strife of this bird, and we will touch on it a little bit later for those who may not be as familiar with it. So we're hoping to at least institute enough change to ensure the survival of the bird. And I know we're not alone with that. U.S. Fish and Wildlife is trying to do the same thing. So Florida scrub jays are part of the corvid family. If you've heard of them, of course, that's our crows and ravens, who are reported to be such brilliant birds. I think scrub jays are too. Maybe not as brilliant, but they haven't been tested like the crows have been. There are actually 120 species in the corvid family worldwide. 44 of those species live in North, and they call it Middle America because it's not just Central America. Oh, and there's three pictures here of those, of the groups that are part of the Aphlocoma jays, which is what the scrub jay is in. So in Central America, there's 3 species. The unicolored is on the top. Mexican is, I think, the one on the right, and then the transvolcanic is the one on the left on the bottom. Relatively similar looking, as you can tell. So North America, we have the Western, which got split, I think about 4 years ago now, that we now have the California and the Woodhouses. And then, of course, we have the island scrub jay, which is Santa Cruz Island, that they are completely isolated, like the Florida scrub jay, also isolated from this larger group of Aphlocoma jays. The thought is that they were all intermixing a very long time ago. And then as water levels dropped and habitats changed in between areas, this is how the groups got separated, so that we now have these 7 species in North and Middle America. So our Florida scrub jay is what we call endemic. If you've never heard of that before, that means that they live only in one place, only in Florida. And we only have 15 birds like that in the United States that are endemic to the United States. Part of the reason for that is that these guys are non-migratory. They're sedentary. They don't fly really well, which means they aren't going to fly far. A 14-mile movement from where a bird was hatched to where it lives later on in life is noteworthy, does not happen very often. So if you think about, some of our other species that migrate thousands of miles twice a year, it's pretty amazing that these guys go so little distance. In fact, biologist Reed Bowman will tell you that the typical scrub jay actually hatches and lives out in its entire life within about a mile of where that bird hatched. So really, really sedentary birds. So depending on how big your screen is, I tried to make that picture about as big as it could be. They're about 12 inches long from the tip of the beak to the tip of their tail. And they only have a 13.5-inch wingspan, which is not much. If you think about vultures and hawks, and, they have that nice big wingspan to fly with. These guys just don't have that. There are some regional variations. There was a study done about 12 years ago now, genetic study done, where they discovered that there are truly some genetic differences between the birds regionally across the state. We don't know all the details of that yet because we don't know everything there is to know about genetics yet, especially in birds. So they're sexually dimorphic only in ultraviolet light. Now, birds can see ultraviolet, so they can look across yonder and they can tell the difference between the boys and the girls. We can't tell that unless we have a UV light to be able to do it. Blue coloration is actually a structural color versus a pigment. And so this is why the males are brighter and they can be told apart amongst themselves. They're typically monogamous, not 100%. There are divorces and things like that, but there's no indication that there's an ever hanky-panky like some of the other birds do in the bird world. And they actually, the males do some pretty neat courtship displays, and they do this every single year, even though they may have been with that female for 10 years. Prior to nesting, he's going to bring her food and hand it to her, you know, beak to beak, so that he's saying to her, I choose you again this year. He does the nest building, at least the initial nest building. He puts the twigs in, and then she lines it with some nice soft material, like the grassy stuff that comes off of our sable palms, our state tree. She makes it a nice soft bed inside that box that he has made. And she'll lay 3 to 5 eggs, typically 4. She'll sit on those eggs for 18 days, and then she'll have nestlings in that nest for about 18 more days. Then, of course, they're flying around loose, but they still stay with their parents for about 60 to 90 more days, learning how to find food, capture it, how to stay safe, those types of things. And of course, the reality is we call these birds unusual, and they really are, because they do actually stay in family group. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the survival rate of nestlings, unfortunately, is not really good. Only a little under 50%. It's 43%, I think, actually make it out of the nest. And then the fledgling, from the time they're out of the nest until they're a year old, only about 34% of those birds survive. So if you're doing the math, more than 3/4 of these birds never make it to year 1. Now, the good news is, if they've made it to year 1, they've learned a lot from their parents. They've surpassed that little bitty stage that so many critters can eat them during. And 82% of those 1-year birds will make it to be 10 years old, which is a pretty good age for them. That statistic may change. We could not gather that data until banding started. And there are many more people who are banding these birds these days to monitor the populations. And so we may find that this number is a little bit higher than what we think it is now. I think the oldest banded bird that was ever known of was 14 or 15 years old. So the reality is we're lacking data with that one, because we weren't banding birds for a long time. Helpers, those younger birds who stay with their parents for a year or 2 years, they actually increase the parents' age and the success rate of the nests. So having your young from previous years is an absolutely wonderful thing. Typically, they won't keep more than about 5 or 6 birds in a territory, because their territory is only about 40 acres. And so there's limited resources that are available to them, food and water. But it's good for everybody if they do stick around for a while. So because of their non-flight, because of their non-migration, because of their family sticking together, they are really territorial. That pair that has a territory will absolutely defend it. They want to stay right there. They like where they're nesting. They like the amenities that are available. And so they will definitely fight to keep it. I don't think I put in here the information about, they end up in these patches where you got one family here and another family here and another family over here. The larger the scrub area is, the more families you can have in that area. And periodically you'll end up with a father and a son living side by side. Now they're a little less territorial. They'll tolerate each other going back and forth into each other's area, but an interloper from somewhere else, probably not, especially not during nesting season. All right, got all that. So I already told you that they do live in family groups, and I talked a little bit about the helpers. I haven't talked about the sentinels yet, and that's what this bird in this picture is doing. It's looking up into the sky, watching for an aerial predator. It might actually even be looking at one, just keeping an eye on it to see where it is. Typically, there will always be a sentinel, unless there is an absolute threat and everybody dives into the trees to stay safe. There's almost always somebody who will be standing up there, keeping an eye, not only on what's going on up here, but also on the ground, because snakes are also a threat to them. New pairs have a rough road these days because they have such limited habitat that they often have to wait for a pair to break up, which usually means one of the adults has passed away, to get a new territory. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that when we get to the maps. So I talked a little bit earlier about that split that separated our Florida scrub jays from those other populations that are in Central and Western North America and Central America. So the early Pleistocene would be about 2.6 million years ago. Now, we don't have bone structure and, things that we've been able to unearth to know exactly how long ago they got split off. They could have actually still had some access, some interbreeding access as recent as about 12,000 years ago. But certainly by then, they would have been separated from the other populations. So I mentioned that they're cooperative breeders. That means that they have their family members that stay with them, and only 2 to 3% of the world's 10,000 species of birds cooperatively breed. Florida has 3 of them: red cockaded woodpecker, brown-headed nuthatch, and of course our Florida scrub jay. Distribution maps. So these are actually very old maps. As far as I know, nobody has done a map like this. We're working on it so that we'll have data points as to where birds actually are. I can tell you here locally, all these birds that show up and down the coast in Sarasota and Charlotte County, a lot of those Sarasota County birds are gone. A lot of our Manatee County birds are not there anymore. The southern part of the county and some of this northwestern section doesn't have birds anymore either. So just knowing these 3 counties and how there are fewer dots there than what you are actually seeing probably makes that true of just about all of the map that you're looking at. And of course, this big area you see up at the north end here is Ocala National Forest, and they do have the largest population in the state. So all those dots might still be correct for them. Oh, I don't know if I can go back to that. The map that was on the other side was just showing the counties that the birds are still in, because they have been extirpated from several counties in the time that we've actually been monitoring them. So 30 years or so. So part of the problem for them is that they're habitat restricted. If you're unfamiliar with the scrub, we will talk a little bit more about that so that you'll get more familiar with it. But if you look at this tree that this bird is standing in, this is the typical tree that grows here in our area. It's Geminata. It's the Geminata species of the scrub oak. And it only is going to grow in the highest, driest areas. And so this is what they need. They need it to make their nests. They need it for the acorns that are growing on it. I was hoping this one does have, no, I don't see any acorns. But they grab those acorns and they bury them every year. That's what gets them through the winter when they're may not be any bugs left because we've gotten cold weather in Florida. So typically where it's going to grow is actually ancient sand dunes. This is why we have such a good ridge of birds in the center of the state, because when we had higher water levels prior to 12,000 years ago, we were underwater, but the ridge still existed. So that's where the birds were. And of course, that was the beach. So the water was lapping up onto that and creating these sandy dunes. If you've ever been to the scrub in the center of the state, you know that that can be some really deep, deep sand. What we typically have here was sand that rolled off of that beach underwater. So we are what's called alluvial. This was sand that got moved to this area. And of course, then it got left behind when the water receded, and we ended up with these, very unusual plants that are in that area. So it's nutrient poor, it's sand, it doesn't have a whole lot of organic material in it to grow plants. And it was really well drained. Water does not stay in it for long. So only these few plants really do well in this super, super dry habitat. And of course, the beautiful thing for the scrub jays is most of the other birds, I think, don't want to live there. So it's theirs. They don't have to compete with too many other species as long as the habitat is maintained in a natural scrub environment. So there's two different white oaks, Myrtle oak and Sandhill oak. We have all four of these in this area, though we have some more than others. The two red oaks are much more prevalent for us, the Geminata and the Chapmans, but they're all here. Even the Inopino, which is kind of rare for our area, it can be found out in our scrub areas. So I said already that they utilize these oaks for the nests. This little spot in the middle here might be a good spot to put a nest in, where all these little branches are and there's greenery covering it to keep them safe from predators. So this is probably not perfect scrub habitat. I'd like to see a little more short shrubby plants in here for it to be great for scrub jays, but these tall trees, and only a few of them, are perfect because they can get up into that tree and sentinel there, and everybody else can stay in the lower part of the habitat and stay safe and eat and do their thing. So the palmettos that you see in here, this low shrubby, you really only want at a maximum about 40% of that. But you also need open sandy areas. I mentioned that they bury their acorns every year, and so they need some place to bury them, and that's what those sandy areas are for. And I did say there should be some scrub oaks in here. So you can see some in the background here, but not so much in the foreground in that picture. So fire, of course, is a natural part of Florida ecosystems. Our ecosystems, most of them have evolved to deal with somewhat frequent fires. The scrub is definitely one of those. On average, a good burn schedule is about every 10 years, but it kind of depends on how fast your scrub grows. If it grows much faster and the birds aren't able to reproduce as well because the scrub is getting too high, then you burn it sooner than 10 years. The biggest challenge is when you burn like this, it can be 3 to 4 years for acorns. Sometimes you'll get them in 2 years, but the oaks don't produce acorns every year. And so even though you might get lucky that one of them is producing in 2 years, the others might not be. And of course, if your predominant one is not, it could be the 3rd or 4th year before you really have some acorns out there. Now, the good news is that when they've buried their acorns, this is a study that was actually done on the California scrub jay. They can remember 10,000 acorns that they've buried in a year. So They can't eat all those in 1 year. And in fact, the red oak acorns will last longer in the ground than the white oak acorns. So they'll tend to eat the white ones first and leave the red ones. The tannins will leach out of it over time, making it a little more palatable, but it also keeps it preserved. So in the second year after a burn, they can still potentially dig up acorns from 2 years ago and have those to eat. So the ideal burn is what they call Apache cool burn. And if you notice, there's lots of green in the background here. And if I had done a 360 picture, you would see that there were green areas around me as well. So this has done a great job of lowering the habitat here while still leaving oak shrubs in the background. And of course, with site fidelity, that's why this is so important, because you have to hope that this family has a little bit of both habitats, both the burned and the non-burned. So they were listed by the state of Florida before they made it onto the federal list. They were listed here in 1975. It took another 12 years for us to get them on the federally threatened list, which is where they still are today, even though our numbers have continued to drop. In 1992, there was an estimate that there were about 4,000 families, 11,000 scrub jays across the state. But because we have data from naturalists from even the 1800s and into the early 1900s, we know that by that time, we had actually probably lost 90% of the birds already. So by the time we were really looking at them and really counting them and learning about them, we had lost the bulk of the population already at that point. I mentioned that they've been extirpated. They've been extirpated from 8 counties already, so they only exist in 31 counties in the state. In 5 of those counties, there are less than 30 families. In only 9 counties do we have more than 30 families. And this is really important because scientifically, we think there need to be at least 30 families in order for genetic diversity to continue to be effective. So in just 9 counties across the state, do we have enough population for the birds to persist over time? This is actually even about 5 years old. They're talking about doing a new statewide survey. We definitely need to do it because these numbers are relatively old. But we're still working on these numbers because we don't have new ones. So approximately 3,000 families, 7,000 Florida scrub jays. And again, most of them, the biggest portion of them are along the ridge and up in Ocala National Forest, which, by the way, is doing a great job to help the population up there. Fish and One of the biologists with Fish and Wildlife has convinced the Forestry Service, who actually manages it because it is a national forest, to clear cut some areas. And by clear cut, I mean they're taking down all the big pines that were planted there for the forestry, for wood, for Americans. And so they're basically opening up scrub that hasn't been opened in, I don't know how long, probably 100 years. And these birds are just pouring into those areas. It's pretty amazing to see how many birds are actually up there. So what we really need to do to help these birds, number one, we have to maintain their habitat. Unfortunately for them, we like high, dry land too. Nobody wants to live where it's going to flood. And so this is why we have developed so much of their habitat and why we have lost so many of these birds. By the way, this is not truly a molting bird. This is actually a baby who's just getting his new feathers. So how do we maintain that habitat? If we can't let wildfires go, which we can't because it's a threat to people, then we have to do prescribed fire. Which means that we pick a day not a date, but a day where the wind is in a particular direction at a particular speed and the humidity is at a particular level, which means the fire can be controlled so it doesn't become a wildfire. And then that's when a particular area will be burned. Occasionally we can't do that because there's neighborhoods that live next door. A lot of you are probably familiar with Oscar Shearer. This is the situation they're now in. They're surrounded by housing, and so they have to do mechanical work where they're actually cutting and sometimes even digging up the plants to create sandy areas, because fire is just not always an option for them. Something else that we have started talking about very much, where if you've got a parcel of land here that's got scrub jays and a parcel of land here that's got scrub jays, can we create a way that these birds can get back and forth between the two? So this is where U.S. Fish and Wildlife is kind of concentrating their efforts, so that if there's land to be purchased, this is where they want to get it, so that instead of having 15 families here and 10 families here, now maybe you've got a group, a meta population of 25 families. Now they got a better chance at longer survival. So, you know, this is hopefully one day going to create new scrub jay sites for us, if we do it right and the birds do respond well to it, hopefully. So another option to help these birds is translocation. There were other translocation attempts made, but the first successful one was actually right here in Manatee County. They moved birds from some outlying areas and brought them together. And those birds have now reproduced and spread it mostly into some swift mud properties, the Southwest Florida Water Management and Manatee County's Duet Preserve. There are other sites where translocations are happening. Some of them are doing okay. Some of them are not doing as well, but they're trying different things. Actually, one is just flat moving birds within their genetic group. Another one is actually moving birds from a different genetic group. So we're not only trying a translocation, but we're trying to cross that genetic barrier a little bit. And of course, those birds are, their blood is tested and they're closely monitoring them. Cornell Lab of Ornithology is involved in that to watch how things really transpire through all of that. So it'll most likely be another 7 to 10 years before we hear results from that, but at least they're working on it. You know, once we have that data, then we can move forward with utilizing it if possible. So if you've never heard of Jaywatch, this has been going on since 2002. It was originally set up by the Nature Conservancy with help from Florida scrub jay biologists, in order to count scrub jays and figure out where they are, how reproduction is going, and that type of thing. And again, this is why banding the birds can become so important, because then we can see when we go to do Jaywatch that it's the same banded bird that's there year after year after year. We know that they're persisting there. It's not that new birds keep moving into the habitat. So they started out with just 15 sites. We're now monitoring about 46 sites in 19 counties. There are certainly more that we could do, but it's being run by Audubon, Florida now. And their stance is that they don't push on to land managers to allow surveys. They wait for the land manager to come to them. So if you know anybody who is a land manager and has scrub jays and they want to know how many are there, contact Audubon, Florida. We actually just lost our, well, we didn't lose her, but Marianne Corsi was our head guru for quite a few years now, 6-7 years she had that job, and she's just retired. So we're going to have a new person in there running Audubon, Florida. It'll be interesting to see how things change with somebody with new ideas. So we conduct Jaywatch in the heat of the summer in the hottest part that you could possibly go to in the scrub in the state, from June 15th to July 15th. But the reason we do that is because these juveniles will only be able to be identified until sometime in August. Then they start getting all those blue feathers covering up the brown feathers on their head. And then they just look like an adult. We can't count the juveniles anymore. And we like to be able to do that because then we know reproduction is happening in a particular area. I didn't know that was going to start automatically. We can also tell the females. They don't do this year round, but this clicking sound, only a female will do that. Now, of course, remember I talked a little bit earlier about the UV lighting and that they can tell the difference between each other, but this is the only way we can identify a female. A bird that doesn't do that, we cannot say definitely is a male, because a lot of females won't do that if there's another female in the territory that is. So we try to identify the family groups and where their territories are. And of course, colored bands are helpful, as I mentioned. And what we do is we go out there 3 days in a row. We play a recording. We have specific points that we go to every single year, year after year. And this gives us data across the years to help determine what's going on with them. So why might you want to participate? Exposure to scientific study. You contribute to the management of that land, because if there are scrub jays there reproducing, we know that the habitat is good. If they have stopped reproducing, then potentially the habitat needs to be managed, burned, or whatever to open it back up for them. And of course, like I said, it's my favorite bird. So you get to see these lovelies, and they really have fantastic characters. They're a lot of fun to be around.